New York City, February 1964. 11:47 a.m., Central Park was cold. The kind of cold that makes your breath visible, that makes your fingers stiff, that makes most people stay inside where it's warm and safe and comfortable. But three elderly men sat on a bench near Bethesda Fountain. Late 60s, maybe 70s, hard to tell. Age and hardship had worn their faces in ways that made years irrelevant. They had instruments, a guitar, an accordion, a tambourine. Not expensive instruments, worn instruments, the kind that had survived decades of use, of travel, of being the only valuable thing you owned. They were playing, not for a crowd. There was no crowd. Too cold, too early, too weekday for tourists. They were playing for themselves, for the memory of when music mattered, when they'd been younger, when the world had been different, when they'd believed music could change things. They were playing an old folk song, pre-war, the kind their parents had taught them, the kind that reminded them of a time before everything got complicated, before age made them invisible, before the world stopped caring about old men with guitars. Four young men walked past, British. You could tell by the accents, by the way they dressed, by the way they moved through the park like they owned it, like they were important, like they mattered in ways old men with accordions never would. One of them stopped, listened, really listened. Not the polite pause people give street musicians. Real listening, the kind that meant something. Paul McCartney turned to the others. "Do you hear that?" John, George, and Ringo stopped, listened, heard the old men playing, heard the song, heard something in it that mattered, something that reminded them of where they came from, of who they'd been before they became the Beatles. And what happened in the next 45 minutes didn't just honor three elderly musicians. It proved that respect transcends generations, that music connects people across decades, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is acknowledge the people who came before you, who paved the way, who made your success possible. But to understand why what the Beatles did in Central Park that February morning became one of the most profound moments of their career, why elderly musicians still talk about it 60 years later, you need to understand what it meant to be an old musician in 1964, and why these three men mattered more than anyone realized. Their names were Samuel Cohen, Thomas O'Brien, and Joseph Lombardi, ages 68, 71, and 69 respectively. They'd been playing music together for 45 years, since the 1920s, since before radio, before television, before music became something you consumed instead of something you created. They'd been professionals once, real musicians, playing clubs, weddings, parties, making a living, not a fortune, but enough to raise families, to pay rent, to feel like they mattered, like their talent meant something. But the world had changed. Music had changed. The 1950s brought rock and roll, young music, loud music, music that didn't need accordions or folk songs, or men in their 60s who remembered when Benny Goodman was revolutionary. By 1964, Samuel, Thomas, and Joseph were obsolete, too old for the new music, too experienced to start over, too proud to stop playing entirely. So they played in Central Park, for themselves, for the memory of who they'd been, for the proof that they still existed even if the world had forgotten them. They played that morning because it was Tuesday, because the rent was paid and they had nowhere else to be, because music was the only thing that made them feel like they hadn't wasted their lives, like the decades of practice and performance and sacrifice had meant something. The four young men approached. The shortest one, the one with the boyish face, spoke first. "Excuse me, gentlemen, that song you're playing, that's She Begs She More, Irish folk song. My mother used to sing it." Samuel looked up, recognized the accent. Liverpool, not Irish, but close enough. "You know this song?" "My whole childhood," Paul said. "She'd sing it when she was cooking, when she was happy, when she wanted to remember where she came from. It's beautiful. You play it beautifully." Thomas, the accordion player, smiled. First genuine smile in weeks. "Thank you, son. Not many young people know the old songs anymore. Everything's rock and roll now. Elvis, Chuck Berry, that sort of thing." "We play rock and roll," John said, "but we learn from songs like this, from folk music, from the music our parents and grandparents taught us. Without songs like this, rock and roll wouldn't exist. You know that, right?" Joseph, the tambourine player, looked skeptical. You're just being polite. Young people don't care about old music, about old musicians. We're yesterday's news. You're tomorrow's. We're the Beatles, George said quietly, and we care, very much. The three old men stared, didn't recognize the name, didn't know who the Beatles were. They didn't listen to current music, didn't have televisions, didn't know that these four young men were the biggest thing in music, that they'd been on Ed Sullivan 2 days ago, that America was losing its mind over them. Never heard of you, Samuel said honestly, but that's all right. We're old. We don't keep up with new things. That's okay, Paul said smiling, but we've heard of you. Not you specifically, but musicians like you, the ones who kept music alive before it became commercial, before it became about money and fame, when it was just about playing, about creating, about community. You're the reason we do what we do. Can we sit? Ringo asked. Can we listen properly? The old men looked at each other, confused. Why would four young British men want to sit in the cold and listen to three old Americans play folk songs nobody cared about? Suit yourselves, Thomas said, but we're not very good anymore. Fingers don't work like they used to. Memory's not what it was. We forget lyrics, miss notes. We're just old men pretending we still matter. You're not pretending, John said, sitting on the frozen ground in his expensive coat. The others joined him, 4 Beatles, sitting in the dirt, in front of 3 elderly musicians who had no idea who they were. You do matter, and we'd like to hear more, if you don't mind. Samuel started playing again, an old Union song from the 1930s, about workers standing together, about dignity and labor, about refusing to be broken by systems that wanted to grind you down. His voice cracked, wavered, not from age, from emotion, from being seen, from being heard by people who actually cared. The Beatles listened, not politely, genuinely. You could see it in their faces, the way they leaned forward, the way they closed their eyes, the way they absorbed every note, every lyric, every moment. When the song ended, Paul was crying. That was incredible. Where did you learn that? Learned it from my father, Samuel said. He was a union organizer, got fired, blacklisted, lost everything, but he never stopped singing, never stopped believing music could change things. I promised him I'd keep the songs alive, keep playing, even when nobody cared. We care, George said, and I think you should know something. That song you just played, it influenced everything we do. All of rock and roll comes from songs like that, from workers' songs, from folk music, from people who used music to resist, to survive, to stay human in systems that wanted to make them machines. John stood up. Gentlemen, would you mind if we played something for you? Something we wrote, as a way of saying thank you, for keeping the music alive, for being the bridge between then and now. You want to play for us? Joseph asked, incredulous. Why? Because you deserve it, Paul said simply. Because you've been playing for decades and nobody's honored you. Nobody's said thank you. Nobody's acknowledged that what you do matters. And that's wrong. So we're fixing it. Right now. The Beatles didn't have instruments, but Paul borrowed Samuel's guitar. John took the tambourine. George and Ringo harmonized. And they played. Not a hit. Not one of their famous songs. An old Liverpool folk song. The kind their grandparents sang. The kind that connected them to these 3 old men. That proved music was universal. Timeless. Something that belonged to everyone across generations. As they played, something happened. People started gathering. New Yorkers, tourists, people who recognized the Beatles, people who didn't but heard music and stopped. Within 10 minutes, 200 people surrounded them, watching, listening, understanding they were witnessing something rare. When the Beatles finished, the crowd applauded, but Paul held up his hand. Wait, this applause isn't for us. It's for these 3 gentlemen, Samuel, Thomas, Joseph. They've been making music for 45 years. They've kept the old songs alive. They've honored tradition while the world moved on. They deserve your respect, your recognition, your appreciation. He started clapping, not for himself, for the 3 old men. The crowd joined, 200 people, applauding elderly musicians they'd walked past 1,000 times without seeing, without caring, without understanding they were in the presence of living history. Samuel started crying. Thomas put his face in his hands. Joseph just stared, unable to process, unable to believe that after 45 years of being invisible, the Beatles had seen them, had honored them, had made them matter. Paul knelt down. "Sir, can I ask you something? Do you still play regularly?" "Every Tuesday," Samuel said through tears. "Here, same bench, same time, for 15 years. Since my wife died. Since the clubs stopped hiring us. Since we became too old to matter." "You matter," Paul said, "and I want everyone to know it. I'm going to tell this story about 3 musicians who kept folk music alive, who honored tradition, who remind us that before rock and roll, before Elvis, before anything modern, there were people like you, playing for the love of it, for the memory of it, for the proof that they were human, and music was the evidence." John added, "And we want people to know that when we were sitting in Liverpool, learning guitar, writing songs, dreaming about being musicians, there were people like you, all over the world, keeping music alive, not for fame, not for money, for love, for tradition, for the understanding that music is the thread connecting generations. You're that thread, and we're grateful." The Beatles stayed for another hour, playing with the 3 old men, talking, sharing stories, not as celebrities and fans, as musicians, as people who understood that music was bigger than success, bigger than fame, bigger than generations. Music was the thing that made humans human, and these 3 old men had dedicated their lives to it. Before they left, Paul gave Samuel all the money in his wallet, $200, a fortune to an old man playing for nickels. "This isn't charity, this is payment, for teaching us, for reminding us, for being what we hope to be when we're your age, still playing, still caring, still believing music matters." "I can't accept this," Samuel protested. "You can, and you will, because you've earned it. 45 years of music, of keeping traditions alive, of being invisible while doing something beautiful. That deserves compensation. That deserves recognition. That deserves more than we can give. But this is what we have. Please take it." Samuel took the money, divided it with Thomas and Joseph. That money fed them for months, paid rent, bought medicine, kept them alive long enough to keep playing, to keep the music going. In 1967, Samuel Cohen died. At his funeral, his grandson read a letter Samuel had written 2 weeks before passing. In it, Samuel described that day in Central Park, the day the Beatles stopped, the day they listened, the day they honored 3 old men nobody else saw. "They could have walked past," Samuel wrote. "They were young, famous, important. We were old, forgotten, irrelevant. But they stopped. They listened. They played with us. They made us matter. And in that moment, I understood that my life hadn't been wasted, that the music mattered, that keeping the old songs alive mattered, that I mattered. The Beatles gave me that, and I died grateful." That letter was published in the New York Times, became famous, reminded a generation that respecting elders isn't weakness, it's wisdom, that honoring the past doesn't mean rejecting the future, it means building bridges between them. Years later, Paul was asked about that day. "Do you remember the 3 old men in Central Park?" "Every detail," Paul said, "because they reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that we weren't the beginning of music, we were the middle, part of a chain going back centuries, forward centuries. Those 3 men represented the past, we represented the present, and together, we represented the truth. That music doesn't belong to one generation, it belongs to everyone. And respecting the people who came before you isn't nostalgia, it's gratitude. It's understanding your place in history. It's being humble enough to admit you're standing on shoulders. And those 3 men had strong shoulders." February 1964, 3 elderly musicians played in Central Park, and the Beatles stopped everything, listened, honored them, played with them, made them visible, made them matter, made them feel like their 45 years of music hadn't been wasted. And the elderly musician's response was everything. Not words, tears, gratitude, the understanding that they'd been seen, finally, after decades of being invisible. That's the Beatles nobody talks about enough, the ones who stopped for old men, who honored tradition, who understood that respecting your elders isn't just politeness, It's recognizing that you exist because they existed, that your music exists because they kept music alive, that you matter because they mattered first. If you're over 60, this story is for you, because you're like Samuel, Thomas, and Joseph. You've lived, you've contributed, you've kept things alive, and sometimes the world makes you feel invisible, makes you feel like you don't matter anymore, makes you feel like yesterday's news. But you matter. You always mattered. And if the Beatles understood that in 1964, then maybe the rest of us can understand it now. That age doesn't diminish value, that experience is wisdom, that the people who came before us deserve our respect, our gratitude, our acknowledgement that we're here because they were there first. That's everything. Look, if this story moved you, especially if you're over 60, do me a favor, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who feels invisible, someone who's kept things alive while the world moved on. We've now completed 75 Beatles stories, stories that prove they weren't just musicians. They were human beings who cared, who saw people, who understood that fame means nothing if you don't use it to make invisible people visible. Drop a comment and let me know, are you over 60? Do you remember when things were different? Do you feel seen? Turn those notifications on because these stories are for you, about you, honoring you. Remember, you matter. You always have. You always will. And the Beatles proved that in Central Park in 1964, when they stopped for three old men and made them visible.